Somewhere in Haifa Harbor, in the last week of November 1940, a man is carrying explosive material past British sentries, and the 1,800 people he is trying to save have no idea he exists. His name is Munya Mardor. He is young, unremarkable to look at, the kind of man a checkpoint guard glances at once and forgets. That is the entire point. Nobody is supposed to remember his face tonight. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers the network's other unsung rescues, the crossings that succeeded and the ones that ended like Kladovo did, the kind of detail that never made a headline. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description. Then stay with us. This story is just getting started. Mardor works for an organization most of the world has never heard of, Mossad Bet, not the intelligence agency people know today. This one was built years earlier by the Haganah Underground, built to do one thing the British Empire had declared a crime: bring Jewish refugees into Palestine without a stamp of permission. For 2 years, that network has run people down the Danube River, through territory crawling with Nazi checkpoints, past officials who could have every one of them shot or shipped to a camp with a single radio call. It has lost ships. It has lost agents. It has lost people it can never get back. Tonight, all of that history is standing on a single deck in Haifa Harbor, and it is about to be erased. A ship called the Patria sits at the dock. 11,885 tons of French-built steel, and on board her are the very refugees this secret network spent 2 years trying to save. They survived the river. They survived the checkpoints. They survived a war zone that was actively hunting them. In a matter of hours, the British are going to sail every one of them 4,000 miles away to an island most have never heard of, with no date attached for when or if they will ever be allowed back. Mardor has been sent to stop that ship from leaving. He has not been given weeks. He has not been given a rehearsal. He has a narrow window, a device that needs to reach a specific point below deck, and a harbor crawling with British soldiers who have no idea what is being carried past them in the dark. The first risk is the simplest one, and also the most immediate. If a single guard stops him, searches the wrong bag, asks the wrong question at the wrong moment, this operation ends before it begins, and so does he. There is no cyanide pill tucked into a lining, no cover story elaborate enough to survive a real interrogation. If Mardor is caught tonight, the network above him has no mechanism to extract him, no diplomatic channel to invoke, nothing beyond the hope that whatever he says under pressure buys enough time for others to disappear before British intelligence can trace the thread back any further than his own name. That is the arithmetic underground work runs on. Not certainty, just odds, weighed carefully, and accepted anyway, because the alternative, doing nothing while 1,800 people sail toward an island with no return date, is not an alternative anyone in this network is willing to accept. The second risk is quieter, and in some ways, worse. Nobody planning this mission has had the time to properly study what is actually holding this ship together. The Patria was requisitioned, not built for this. Nobody has told Mardor what condition her hull is really in, and nobody currently has the time to find out. He does not know that yet. He only knows what he has been told. Get below deck, place the charge, get out. Mardor is not new to this kind of work, but he is new to a job this size. Most of what the network has asked of him before tonight involved paperwork rather than explosives. Forged transit documents, coded messages passed between agents who never use their real names in front of each other. Tonight is different, and everyone above him in the chain of command knows it, which is part of why they chose someone whose face nobody in British intelligence has any particular reason to recognize. He is one of perhaps a handful of people inside the entire Mossad Bet network who even know an operation like this is happening tonight. The organization runs on compartmentalization the same way any underground movement has to. Agents who move refugees down the Danube do not know the names of agents forging papers in Bucharest. Neither of them knows what is about to happen in Haifa Harbor tonight, and that ignorance is not an oversight. It is protection for all of them in case any single piece of the network is ever caught. Above him, on the decks he cannot see, 1,800 people are doing what people do the night before a forced departure. Some are praying. Some are arguing over which of their few possessions they are allowed to bring to an island in the Indian Ocean. Some are simply sitting in silence, having run out of the energy it takes to be afraid anymore. None of them know a stranger is moving through the lower decks of their ship, carrying something that could change everything about the next 24 hours. None of them chose this. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Every person on the Patria tonight already made their choice, back in Vienna, in Bratislava, on a riverboat sliding past Nazi patrols on the Danube. They chose to run. They chose to trust a secret network of strangers with their lives once already. Now their fate is in the hands of that same network again, and this time they don't even know it. Mardor is not acting alone in the sense that matters most. Above him, inside the Hagane's leadership, a small internal group has already made the call that put him on this ship tonight. They are calling it disabling the vessel. Not destroying it, not endangering the people aboard it. Disabling. That distinction matters enormously to the men who gave the order. Whether it will matter in the same way to the 1,800 people trying to sleep above him tonight is a very different question, and it is one that has not been answered yet. There is a cost sitting inside this operation that nobody in the room who approved it has fully priced in. Not the risk of capture, not the risk of failure. Something closer to the ground. Something about what it means to gamble with the safety of the very people your entire organization exists to protect. Mardor will carry a version of that weight for a very long time. He does not know that yet either. Right now, he is thinking about footsteps, about timing, about a charge that needs to be small enough to do exactly what it is meant to do and nothing more. Small enough. That phrase is doing more work than anyone realizes tonight. Because somewhere in the calculations that got this device built, in the hands that measured out exactly how much explosive material a ship like this should be able to absorb without serious harm, a piece of information is missing. Nobody planning this operation has an accurate picture of just how fragile this particular hull actually is. To understand why a man like Mardor is even here tonight, it helps to go back 2 years, to a decision made not in Palestine but in London. In 1938, the British government began signaling that it intended to shut the door on Jewish immigration into Palestine almost entirely. It became formal policy the following year, in a document that came to be known as the White Paper. 75,000 permits total, spread across 5 years, and after that, close to nothing. For people watching Nazi Germany strip Jews of citizenship, property, and increasingly their lives, that sealing did not read as policy. It read as abandonment with a bureaucratic signature attached. The Hagane's answer was to build a second immigration system underneath the one the British controlled. A system the British were never meant to see coming. They called it Alia Bet, and the organization built to run it worked out of Athens first, then Paris, coordinating a route that still sounds almost too dangerous to be real. Refugees moved by train to river ports, boarded onto barges and old paddle steamers, sent down the Danube itself, through the heart of a continent hunting them, toward the Black Sea and eventually the Mediterranean. This is the detail most retellings of this story skip past. These were not boats slipping quietly out of friendly harbors under cover of darkness somewhere far from danger. These ships sailed through Nazi waters, down a river that ran past Vienna, past Bratislava, through territory under direct German pressure or outright German control, on vessels that could be boarded, searched, or seized at any checkpoint along the way. Some of the people who made that route possible were not heroes in any clean sense. In Vienna, a Jewish businessman named Berthold Storfer organized transports of his own, refugees moving down the same river. But Storfer answered to Adolf Eichmann. He operated with SS approval hanging over every decision he made. Other rescue organizers refused to touch his operation, calling him a collaborator to his face. Whether Storfer was a pragmatist working the only channel available to him, or something closer to complicit, is still argued by historians today. What isn't argued is that his transports put people on the water. In October of 1940, 4 riverboats under his organization, the Uranus, the Schönbrunn, the Helios, and the Melk, carried refugees down toward Romania. The Danube route itself was never a single fixed path. Agents adjusted it constantly depending on which ports remained accessible, which local officials could be bribed or persuaded, and which stretches of river had grown too dangerous to risk that particular month. A route that worked in the summer of 1939 might be closed entirely by the following winter, forcing the network to improvise a new one under pressure, often with refugees already committed to the journey and no way to turn back. This meant the agents running Mossad Aliyah Bet's European operations needed something closer to the skill set of intelligence officers than humanitarian aid workers. They needed contacts inside port authorities who could be persuaded to look away. They needed forged documentation convincing enough to survive inspection by officials who had every incentive to catch a forgery and report it. They needed a working knowledge of which local administrators in Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia could be trusted, at least for the length of a single transaction, and which ones would sell the entire operation to German authorities the moment it became profitable to do so. Not every voyage on this route ended the way anyone hoped. In November of 1939, a separate group, roughly 1,000 refugees, made the same journey from Vienna to Bratislava and down the Danube. At the Romanian border, their boats were turned back. They were stranded in Yugoslavia, still stranded a year and a half later when the Nazi invasion caught up with them. Most of the men were shot in a field near a town called Kladovo. The women and children were sent to a camp where they died of starvation, disease, or gas. That is what failure looked like on this route, not a footnote in an after-action report, an execution. So when the Uranus's roughly 1,000 passengers transferred onto a larger ship called the Pacific and actually cleared the Black Sea in October of 1940, followed by a second group aboard a ship called the Milos, it was not a routine crossing. It was a network beating odds that had already killed people it loved, people it had trained agents specifically to protect. They arrived off Haifa on the 1st of November, and the British were waiting. Under the terms of the White Paper, these refugees had no legal right to enter Palestine, whatever they had survived to get there. The colonial government's answer was a place called Mauritius, a British island in the Indian Ocean, 4,000 miles from Palestine, from Europe, from anyone these refugees knew by name. Not a detention camp with a release date printed somewhere on a form. Something closer to permanent removal, dressed in the language of temporary relocation. The vessel chosen to carry them there was the Patria, requisitioned and sitting in Haifa harbor, and British authorities began transferring refugees from the Pacific and the Milos onto her decks almost immediately. Then word reached the Haganah that a third ship, the Atlantic, carrying close to 1,800 more refugees, was also being intercepted, its passengers slated for the same manifest. Haifa itself, by late 1940, was not an easy city to move through unnoticed. It functioned as one of the primary naval and administrative hubs for British Mandate Authority in Palestine, which meant checkpoints, harbor patrols, and a colonial police presence that had spent years learning to watch for exactly the kind of movement the Haganah now needed to carry out. Every plan built inside the network had to assume that ordinary vigilance, not incompetence, was what stood between them and discovery. That is part of what made the timeline so unforgiving. The Haganah did not have weeks to study the Patria's layout, her guard rotations, or the habits of the men assigned to watch her. They had days, compressed further by the arrival of the Atlantic's passengers, which meant the deportation order could move forward on a schedule the network could not control and barely had time to react to. For the Haganah's leadership, this was the moment 2 years of work could be erased by a single act of imperial bureaucracy. Every refugee smuggled down the Danube, every riverboat that made it through, every agent who had risked arrest or worse across occupied Europe, all of it would count for nothing If these 1,800 people simply vanished onto a British ship bound for an island with no return date attached, a small internal body inside the Haganah, sometimes referred to afterward as the Committee of Four, made the call. They could not fight the Royal Navy in open water. They could not storm Haifa Harbor with the numbers they had, but they could disable the Patria before she sailed, not sink her, disable her, damage her engines or her hull enough to keep her tied to the dock, buy time, force the British into a negotiation they had never intended to have. The man they selected to carry that plan onto the ship, physically, in the dark, past armed guards who had no idea what was walking past them, was Munya Mardor. Among the 1,800 people aboard the Patria that night are families who crossed borders on foot before they ever reached a riverboat. Children who have not seen a stable roof over their heads in over a year, and elderly passengers who made the entire Danube crossing knowing full well they might not survive it, and chose to attempt it anyway because the alternative was certain rather than possible death. None of them know the name Munya Mardor. Most of them will never know it, not in 1940, and for many of them, not ever. The network built to protect people like this one operates on the assumption that the people it protects should never have to know how thin the margin actually was, should never have to carry the weight of understanding just how close to failure their rescue came at every single stage. That anonymity cuts both ways. It protects the refugees from a burden they did not ask to carry, and it protects the network from the refugees themselves, from the risk that any one of 1,800 frightened, exhausted people might say the wrong thing to the wrong official under pressure and unravel an operation none of them were ever told about in the first place. Some among them have already spent months moving between transit camps, waiting on decisions made by governments that did not particularly want them and organizations that could not always keep their promises. A ship, even one bound for an island none of them chose, can feel at this point almost like the first concrete outcome after a year of nothing but uncertainty. That is part of what makes the night ahead so difficult to reckon with afterward. The people the operation is meant to protect are, in this exact moment, simply trying to get through one more transfer, unaware that their fate is about to be decided by a stranger they will never meet, based on a calculation nobody has had time to check. Mossad Lealia Habet does not run one operation at a time. While Mardor moves through the Patria's lower decks tonight, other agents in the same network are managing entirely different problems in entirely different cities. Someone is negotiating for fuel for a vessel still sitting in a Balkan port. Someone else is trying to secure exit papers for a group of teenagers in Bratislava whose parents did not survive to make this journey with them. None of those agents know what is happening in Haifa tonight. None of them need to. The charge is set. Mardor has not left the lower decks yet, and that gap between arming a device and getting clear of it is the part nobody talks about when they plan an operation like this from a room somewhere else, far from the corridors where it actually has to happen. He has to move back through the same passages he came through, past the same points where a guard's schedule was only ever a guess, built from a handful of hours of observation and nothing more. Nothing about the walk-out is guaranteed simply because the walk-in worked. Somewhere above him, closer to the upper decks, a British officer changes his rounds without explanation. It is the kind of small deviation that means nothing on most nights and everything on this one. Mardor freezes in a stairwell that was not part of anyone's plan. For several seconds, the entire operation depends on whether a man he cannot see decides to walk 10 feet in one direction instead of another, for reasons that have nothing to do with Mardor at all. The officer moves the other way. Mardor keeps moving, and somewhere in his own head, a thought surfaces that he does not have time to sit with. He has just placed a device on a ship carrying 1,800 people, and he still does not actually know, with any real certainty, whether the men who designed that device understood what this particular ship could survive. That thought belongs to a conversation happening at the same moment, in a different part of the city, among the small group of Haganah leaders who authorized this operation in the first place. They call themselves the Committee of Four, And tonight, hours before the charge is meant to go off, at least one of them is having second thoughts that arrive far too late to matter in any practical sense. The concern is not moral, not entirely. It is technical, and it is exactly the kind of concern that should have surfaced days ago instead of hours before detonation. Nobody in this room has a clear, verified picture of the Patria's actual structural condition. And by now, verifying it is no longer an option available to them. She was requisitioned in a hurry. She was never inspected the way a vessel meant to carry 2,000 people in wartime conditions should have been. She was simply the ship that happened to be sitting in Haifa Harbor when the British needed one on short notice, and nobody afterward went back to check what 2 years of hard use, minimal maintenance, and a rushed wartime refit had actually done to her frame. One of the 4 men in that room says this out loud for the first time, and the fact that it is the first time anyone has said it is itself a kind of confession. He asks whether anyone present actually verified the load calculations against the Patria's real condition, rather than against a standard estimate built for a healthy vessel of her size and class. Nobody answers immediately, and the silence that follows says more than any answer could have. A second man pushes back, reminding the room that the charge was deliberately kept small, that the entire design philosophy behind tonight's operation was restraint, not force. Small enough to jam machinery, small enough to flood a compartment. Not small enough to matter, they believed, in any way that would put lives at risk. He says this with the confidence of a man repeating a decision rather than defending one he has actually re-examined tonight. A third voice in the room, quieter than the other 2, asks the question none of them can answer with any real authority. What happens if the ship's structure cannot absorb even a small charge the way a properly maintained vessel could? There is a version of this meeting where someone says the word abort, and it very nearly happens. Someone in that room raises the possibility of sending word to Mardor to withdraw the device, to call the operation off before detonation, to buy another day to actually inspect what they are dealing with. Another voice in the room raises a different problem entirely, one that has nothing to do with the ship's structure and everything to do with time they no longer have. The Atlantic's passengers are already being processed for transfer. Waiting even a single additional day risks the British moving up the departure rather than delaying it, which would mean losing the narrow window the operation depends on altogether. There is also the matter of what happens to Mardor himself if the device is withdrawn rather than detonated. Disarming what has already been armed carries its own danger, arguably greater than leaving it in place, given how little time remains and how unfamiliar the disarming procedure is compared to the arming one he rehearsed. Nobody in the room says it outright, but the calculation underneath the discussion is impossible to avoid. Sending a second, hastily briefed instruction into an active operation increases the number of ways this night can go wrong, not decreases it. Every option in front of them now carries risk that did not exist a day earlier, when there was still time to plan this properly instead of arguing about it after the fact. But there is no reliable way to reach him now. He is already moving through the ship's lower decks, already committed to a timeline that started the moment he armed the charge. Sending someone in after him would multiply the risk of exposure, not reduce it. The room understands this even as at least one of them clearly wishes there were another option. The discussion ends not with a decision to proceed, exactly, but with the absence of any real alternative. The operation is already in motion. Pulling it back, now, carries its own catastrophic risk, a risk nobody in that room is prepared to own, instead of the one they already agreed to. So, they let it run. And somewhere below the decks of a ship holding 1,800 people who have no idea any of this conversation is happening, the clock the Committee of 4 has just decided not to stop keeps counting down toward a number none of them have actually confirmed is safe. Mardor, meanwhile, is dealing with problems of his own that have nothing to do with the argument taking place across the city. Getting off the ship is proving harder than getting on. A second British patrol, one that was not on the rotation he memorized earlier that day, appears at the top of a passage he needs to cross. For a moment, it looks like there is no way through without being seen. and Mardor has to make a choice with almost no information. Wait somewhere exposed and hope the patrol moves on, or attempt a different route he has not fully scouted. He chooses to wait. It is the kind of decision that looks obvious in hindsight and feels like nothing but risk in the moment it is actually made. Waiting means standing still in a space with almost no cover, close enough to hear fragments of conversation between the two guards above him without being able to make out what they are actually saying. He cannot tell whether they are discussing something routine or whether word of unusual movement below deck has already reached them. Both possibilities feel equally real from where he is standing, and there is no way to resolve the question except to keep waiting. He had assumed, going in, that a single pass through this section of the ship would be enough, that the patrol pattern he observed the day before would hold steady into the night. It does not. Whatever schedule the British were keeping earlier has shifted, whether from routine rotation or some unrelated tightening of security tied to the Atlantic's passengers now coming aboard, and Mardor has no way of knowing which. The patrol lingers longer than he expects, long enough that Mardor begins running through what happens if he is still down here when the charge goes off on schedule. Still inside a compartment he has not yet cleared, still close enough to the blast that disabling the ship and ending his own night in the same explosion becomes a real possibility rather than a hypothetical one. There is a moment, brief but real, where it looks like the entire operation might quietly fail without a single shot fired or a single alarm raised. If the patrol does not move, if Mardor cannot clear the ship in time, the safest outcome available to him might be to disarm what he just armed and walk away with nothing accomplished at all. In that stretch of waiting, something close to relief moves through him, uninvited and unwelcome the moment he notices it. Part of him recognizes that a quiet failure tonight would mean walking off this ship alive, with no explosion, no dead, no 17 years of silence still ahead of him. Only the ordinary shame of a mission that simply did not work. He does not let that thought settle. There is no version of tonight where doing nothing counts as success, whatever relief it might offer him personally, and he knows that even as the thought passes through him uninvited. That is the false release moment inside this story. The point where it briefly seems like the night might simply end without consequence, without triumph, without disaster. A quiet failure, a charge that never goes off, a ship that sails on schedule with everyone aboard exactly as unaware as they were an hour ago. Then the patrol moves, not because of anything Mardor does, but because a call comes from somewhere else on the ship, some unrelated matter pulling the officer's attention away from the passage he had been standing in. Mardor clears the corridor. He gets above deck, off the gangway and back into the ordinary movement of dock workers and port traffic that provides the only cover he has left. He does not run. Running would be its own kind of confession, the same instinct that will govern his choices for years after tonight. He is clear. The device is armed, on schedule, on a ship whose actual structural limits nobody in either the room debating it or the corridor concealing it has managed to confirm. For a short stretch of time after leaving the gangway, Mardor's job is simply to behave like a man with nowhere urgent to be. He walks a route that keeps him visible in the ordinary sense, present among dock workers and late harbor traffic, present enough that his absence later would look stranger than his presence does now. Every choice in these minutes is designed around the same principle that has governed the entire operation. Nothing about tonight should look, from the outside, like anything happened at all. He does not know exactly how much time remains before detonation, only that it is measured in minutes rather than hours, and that whatever certainty the men who built this device had about its size no longer belongs to him to verify. His part of the operation is finished. What happens next depends entirely on a calculation made by other people in another room, based on assumptions about a ship none of them ever actually inspected. The Patria does not stay upright for long. What was supposed to be a controlled disabling becomes something no one in that room, or in the water below, has any way to control. The ship goes under in under 16 minutes, and in those 16 minutes, the gap between what was planned and what actually happens becomes impossible to close. 267 people die. 172 more are pulled from the harbor injured, many of them saved not by the British Navy, but by Arab fishermen and dock workers who happen to be nearby and go into the water without waiting for orders from anyone. The hesitation in that room hours earlier, the question about the ship's real condition that never got a clear answer, is no longer a technical concern sitting unresolved on a table. It is the reason a device sized to disable a vessel instead tore her open. In the harbor itself, the 16 minutes between the explosion and the ship's final list under the water become the defining measure of everything that follows. There is no organized evacuation in that window, no time for the kind of orderly response that might have saved dozens more lives. What exists instead is chaos moving at the speed of a sinking hull. Refugees who have already survived a war fighting now for a harbor exit they cannot see in the dark, and rescuers arriving with whatever boats happen to be nearby rather than whatever boats might have been prepared in advance. Word of the sinking reaches the wider city within hours, and with it comes a wave of uncertainty that the British administration is in no hurry to resolve. Official statements in the first day offer little clarity, and for a population already primed to distrust colonial explanations, the vacuum fills quickly with theories that will take years to sort from the truth. Survivors pulled from the harbor that night are processed through hospitals and temporary shelters, many of them still not fully aware of how many people they traveled with did not make it off the ship at all. Families who boarded together in Vienna or Bratislava now search harbor lists and hospital wards for names that will not appear on either. A second wave of loss layered directly on top of everything they had already survived to reach this point. Mardor does not run. He cannot run. Running is what would get him caught, so instead he goes back to his ordinary work at the port the next morning, doing the kind of nothing that draws no attention, while 267 names begin circulating through a city that does not yet know who is responsible. The Haganah does not claim the operation. For years, the truth sits buried under competing rumors that the refugees sabotaged the ship themselves rather than accept exile, that the British were somehow to blame for the sinking, that the vessel simply failed on its own with no outside cause at all. Nobody in leadership corrects any of it, because correcting it means confessing to it. What the operation does produce, almost immediately, is the one outcome nobody in that room could have engineered through negotiation, no matter how many meetings they had held or how many appeals they had filed with colonial administrators. Faced with the deaths of refugees who had already survived the machinery of the Holocaust, the British reverse the deportation order. Winston Churchill personally allows the survivors to remain in Palestine. The policy the entire mission was designed to defeat collapses within days, not because the network out-argued the British Empire in any formal sense, but because the empire could not survive the optics of what its own order had just caused in front of the entire city of Haifa. But policy reversed for these 1,800 people is not the same as the blockade ending. Ships intercepted along the Danube route keep getting intercepted. Refugees stranded at places like Kladovo are still stranded, still waiting on rescue that will not come in time for many of them. The larger war this network is fighting does not end. It only loses one particular front, at a price none of them will ever fully settle. The British, for their part, do not treat the Patria as a reason to soften the broader blockade. If anything, the incident hardens colonial suspicion of the Haganah's underground activity in Palestine, sharpening scrutiny on the port, on the network's known contacts, and on future transports moving through the same waters. The one policy reversal the operation achieves comes bundled with a heavier surveillance burden on everything the network tries to do afterward. The Aliyah Bet effort itself does not stop after Haifa. By 1942, the mounting cost of the blockade, the lack of usable vessels, and the deepening danger across occupied Europe force a temporary slowdown in the network's operations. But the underlying machinery, the contacts, the routes, the accumulated experience of moving people through hostile waters under false papers does not disappear. It resumes in 1944, once the full scale of the final solution becomes undeniable to the Jewish leadership in Palestine, and it continues in various forms for years afterward, carrying tens of thousands more refugees toward a British blockade that never fully closes the door, no matter how many ships it intercepts. 7 years after the Patria sinks in Haifa harbor, a different ship carrying Jewish refugees will make headlines around the world after the British intercept it and force its passengers back to Europe. An incident that will do more to turn international opinion against the blockade than almost anything that came before it. That later story does not exist in isolation from this one. It exists because the machinery built to run ships like the Patria never stopped operating, however much its methods and its costs stayed the same. Within the network itself, the operation becomes something almost nobody discusses directly, even among people who already understand, in general terms, what happened. It exists as an unspoken boundary in conversations between agents who worked other routes, other ships, other rescues, a subject approached only in the vaguest terms when it has to be approached at all. British investigators do open an inquiry into the sinking, and for a period afterward, official explanations shift depending on who is being asked and what political purpose the answer happens to serve. Some accounts in the immediate aftermath suggest the refugees deliberately damaged the ship themselves rather than accept transfer to Mauritius, an explanation that conveniently removes any suggestion of outside sabotage from the record. Other explanations point to mechanical failure, to poor maintenance, to nothing more sinister than an old ship finally giving out under the strain of overcrowding. The Haganah's own internal investigators, meanwhile, run a separate and far more honest inquiry, one focused not on assigning blame publicly, but on understanding privately why a charge sized for a routine disabling produced a catastrophe instead. Their conclusion lands on the same structural weakness one voice in that room had raised hours before detonation, and nobody had time to verify. A superstructure already compromised by age and hard use, unable to absorb what a healthier vessel might have survived with nothing worse than a damaged engine room. That internal conclusion never becomes public in 1940. It sits inside Haganah records, known only to the small circle of people already carrying the operation's weight, for the same 17 years that Mardor himself stays silent. Even within that small circle, the finding is treated less as an explanation to be shared than as a lesson to be absorbed quietly into how future operations get planned. Later missions inside the same network carry a more rigorous insistence on verifying the physical condition of a target before committing to a specific method, a change nobody attributes publicly to the Patria, but one that traces back to exactly this night regardless. Inside the Haganah more broadly, the after-action reckoning is quieter than the operation itself. Nobody stands trial. Nobody is publicly named. But the 4 men who authorize this now carry a number that will follow the organization for decades. Whether or not the public ever learns whose hands built the device or whose voice raised the concern that arrived too late to change anything. For Mardor, the cost is not institutional, it is personal, and it does not fade with time the way institutional costs sometimes do. He keeps working at that same port for longer than comfort would suggest, not out of loyalty to the job itself, but because leaving too soon is its own kind of confession, the same instinct that kept him moving calmly through a stairwell months earlier. He does not speak publicly about that night for 17 years. In the years between, he continues working inside the same underground world that put him on the Patria in the first place, moving through roles that ask for the same qualities that made him useful that night: composure under pressure, a willingness to carry weight nobody else can see, and a capacity to keep functioning normally in the hours and days after something has gone catastrophically wrong. Colleagues who work alongside him in later years describe a man who rarely raises his voice and almost never speaks about the war years in any detail. Whether that reticence comes from discipline, from grief, or from some combination the man himself could never fully separate, is not something any outside account can answer with confidence. What is documented is the outcome: 17 years of silence, broken only when he chose, on his own terms, to put the account into his own words. When he finally does, in 1957, it is in his own words, in his own account, and even then he is careful to say what the operation was never meant to become. There was no intent, he insists, to sink the ship at all. That single sentence is the entire weight of the story compressed into one line. A man who spent a night trying to save 1,800 lives spent the rest of his career carrying the fact that his own hands cost 267 of them. That is what this operation actually took. Not a target, not a strategic objective checked off a list somewhere in Palestine. It took the certainty that doing the right thing carefully is enough, on its own, to keep it from becoming the wrong thing entirely. No amount of restraint built into a plan can substitute for information nobody had time to gather, and no good intention, however sincerely held by every person in that room, changes what happened in the 16 minutes after the charge went off. The Patria was never an isolated decision, made by 4 men in one room on one night. It sat on top of a much older doctrine already running through networks like this one. The idea that direct, deniable action against a slow-moving political blockade could force change that no negotiation, no appeal, no diplomatic channel ever would. That doctrine required a specific kind of infrastructure to function at all. Agents who could move unnoticed through hostile ports. Forgers who could produce documents convincing enough to survive real scrutiny, and a command structure willing to authorize operations it could never publicly acknowledge if they went wrong. The Patria succeeded and failed at the same time precisely because that infrastructure worked exactly as designed right up until the one variable nobody could verify in time. Every piece of that infrastructure had to be built quietly, over years, by people whose names rarely surface in the parts of this history that get taught in classrooms. Recruiters who identified which young men and women could handle work like Mardor's. Contacts inside shipping companies willing to look away from irregular cargo manifests. None of it happens by accident, and almost none of it survives in any single document anyone could simply hand you today. That doctrine did not begin with Mardor, and it did not end with him either. The operations that shaped that doctrine, the ones that came before the Patria and the ones that followed it, are not sitting in any public archive waiting to be found. Some of them, though, are laid out in the operational record we put together in the description below. It walks through the methods, the failures, and the outcomes behind some of the network's other unsung rescues, the successful crossings and the ones that ended the way Kladovo did, the kind of detail that never made it into a headline at the time and never will unless someone goes looking for it deliberately. Nothing in it is dramatized beyond what the surviving records actually support, and nowhere in it does the story try to make the outcome cleaner than it actually was. The link is in the description if you want to go further into it. If this is the first time you have heard Munya Mardor's name, say so in the comments. These are the operations history tends to forget first, and they deserve better than that, and there are more of them waiting to be told.